about their own privacy because they're not doing anything wrong, they do not actually believe that. And the way that I know they don't believe that is that those very same people put passwords on their email and social media accounts. And they put locks on their bedroom and their bathroom doors. Because we all instinctively know that we need places where we can go and think and choose and be and explore without the judgmental eyes of other people being cast upon us. And the thing that I have said, what I have said in every single instance where I've heard somebody say that, and I have done countless debates all over the world in the last year, and I've had people say this to me in all kinds of venues, even on the street, by email, in television debates, in events like this. Whenever anyone says to me, I'm not interested in hiding what I'm doing because I'm not doing anything wrong, I've said the same thing to them every single time, which is, I get a piece of paper and a pen and I write down my email address, and I say, here is my email address. What I would like you to do is, when you get home, email me the passwords to all of your email and social media accounts so that I can troll through everything that you're doing and read whatever it is I want, and then just take things that I'm interested in and publish them online under your name. You should have no reason not to do that because you're not doing anything wrong, so what do you have to hide? And there is not one person who has taken me up on this offer, not a single person. That email obsessively, waiting for somebody to send me their emails, and it's so lonely. It's such a lonely, barren, desolate place because nobody will do that. There was this amazing event that I think illustrated the same point, which was in July of 2013, after we published the story about the NSA collecting the list of all the people with whom you communicate every single day. What the NSA, using a euphemism, calls metadata, which is the list of all the human beings with whom you are having private communications. The very best friend that the NSA has in the world, your state's indescribably heinous Senator Dianne Feinstein. Oh, that's so harsh. I hope I didn't instigate that one. All right, thank you. She went to USA Today and she wrote this op-ed, of course, defending the NSA. And what she said was, this debate, she said, I don't even understand this debate. She said, not only is this information not invasive and not really that personal. I mean, we're not even reading the content of your emails. We're not listening to your telephone conversations. She said, I don't even think this should be called spying. I mean, it's not even espionage. We're just collecting a list of all the people with whom you're communicating. Now, let's leave aside the fact that that was completely false. The US government, the NSA, routinely reads huge amounts of emails, the content of the emails of American citizens, and listens to their telephone calls without warrants. Whenever you speak to a foreign national, they have now the right to do that under the new 2008 surveillance law, but leave that little lie to the side. Metadata, as she calls it, which is the collection of the list of all the people with whom you're communicating, is incredibly invasive. It allows anyone who's collecting that about you to know the most intimate things about you. In fact, there are ways that that can actually let people know more about you than if they were reading your emails and listening to your telephone calls. For instance, if you are a woman who calls an abortion clinic, or you are somebody who calls a physician who is an HIV specialist, or you place a telephone call to a drug or alcohol addiction center, or you call a suicide hotline, or you communicate regularly at night with somebody who is not your spouse. Somebody who is collecting what they call your metadata will know the most invasive information about you, will have a complete picture not only of your life, but of the lives of all the people with whom you're communicating. And so to illustrate this point that the people who say they don't care about privacy invasions don't really believe it, there was this instant online movement in the wake of Dianne Feinstein's op-ed that called for Dianne Feinstein every single day at the end of her workday to post online the list of all the people who she telephoned or who called her or who she emailed with or who she met in person. Because after all, that isn't spying, and of course she would never do that either. That's because all of us understand the real value of privacy, even if we sometimes have difficulty articulating it. And the real value is this. There is a mountain of social science evidence. But I think more compelling are our own personal experiences that demonstrate that when we think we are being watched, our behavior changes substantially. The range of options that we entertain dramatically shrinks. And that's because when we think we're being watched, we tend to make behavioral choices that we believe other people want us to make. And that's because it is a natural human desire to avoid the sense of shame or societal condemnation. We all naturally want to avoid those kinds of judgments. And so a person who believes they're being watched is a person who will make behavioral choices that is much more compliant and much more conformist and much more submissive. That's why every state loves surveillance, because it breeds an easy-to-control and conformist population. And we've all had that experience, the experience that there are all kinds of things that we want to hide from other people. Things that we would tell our psychiatrist or our lawyer or our doctor or our best friend or our spouse or some stranger on the internet that we wouldn't want anybody else to know. Things that have nothing to do with wrongdoing or criminality, but that have to do with who we are as people. And that's because it's only in a realm where we know that we can make choices where we're not being judged and not being watched can we really test the limits of who we want to be. It's really in the private realm where dissent and creativity and personal exploration exclusively reside. And so a world in which privacy is being eliminated in the digital age, a world in which you are going to know that everything that you're doing is susceptible to being monitored by authorities, is a world in which human freedom has been dramatically diminished in a very individual and fundamental way. And this idea that, well, if I have nothing to hide, if I'm not doing anything wrong, I have nothing to hide, it's sometimes easy to laugh at, but it's actually a really pernicious idea to take hold if you think about. Because what it really will then mean, if enough people come to believe that, is that the only people who will want privacy, the only people who will think privacy is important, are people who probably should be regarded as suspicious. Because the only people who value privacy are people who are doing wrong and bad things. That's actually the way the NSA thinks. In their warped mind, they look for, on the internet, people who use encryption to protect their emails. Because they think to themselves, if people are trying to prevent us from knowing what it is that they're doing, that's probably really good evidence that they are doing bad things, and we therefore ought to consider them to be targets. It really makes privacy into evidence that you're a bad person. There's one other implication to this debate that I just want to talk about. The idea that if you're not doing anything wrong, then you don't really have anything to hide. You don't have to worry about surveillance. And I actually realized this for the first time in this very strange way. I did this after the first week of the reporting that I did in Hong Kong. I wrote 5 different articles. I had unveiled Snowden, and I, against my better judgment, went on MSNBC, and I was interviewed by the primetime host Lawrence O'Donnell. And he was asking me a bunch of questions, and at the end of the interview, he issued his pronouncement about the NSA surveillance stories. And he decreed the following. He said, "You know, Glenn, I have listened to your reporting, I've listened to what you said with an open mind, and what I have concluded is that I'm actually not worried. This does not bother me at all. I do not feel threatened in any way by what you've told me the government is doing." And I remember reacting with this extreme amount of irritation when he said that. I mean, like, even more irritation than I normally experience when I'm subjected to hearing Lawrence O'Donnell speaking. And I couldn't really quite figure out why that bothered me so much. And it sat with me for a little while, and about a month later, I read this column by Ruth Marcus, the longtime columnist of the Washington Post, who is a very big supporter of President Obama and whose husband actually served in a senior position in the Obama administration as the head of the Federal Trade Commission. And she had a very similar attitude. She wrote in there, yes, okay, fine, the government's probably collecting everybody's metadata, but you know what, I seriously doubt they're looking at mine. mine, Ruth Marcus's, so I'm not really worried about this. And then 3 weeks later, the longtime columnist and writer for The New Yorker, Henrik Hertzberg, who's also a very good Democrat, he wrote something very similar, he said, but in a New Yorker kind of way. He said, the threat of these privacy invasions are conjectural and abstract, and therefore I don't really feel immediately threatened by them. And what I began realizing is that if you look at those people who say that in this instance, they all have something in common. What they have in common is that they wake up every single day and pretty much more or less defend those who wield the greatest amount of political power. Of course, they're not people who are threatened by a surveillance system. Of course, they're probably right. They actually probably don't have anything to worry about. Or there are people who say, you know what, I have made myself so unthreatening. I am such an impotent, politically passive person that I seriously doubt the government is interested in the recipes that I'm exchanging with my aunt. You'll hear that all the time. And there's this implicit bargain that they have accepted when they say that, which is, I know that if I'm willing to make myself so unthreatening to people who wield power, that in exchange, I won't have to worry about what they might do to me. And therefore, since I am a person who is completely unthreatening to those who wield political power, or in the case of people like Lawrence O'Donnell and Ruth Marcus and Henrik Hertzberg, if I'm somebody who is a devoted servant to those who are in political power, I feel like I don't have anything to worry about. That is the bargain that is being accepted. And I think it's really critical to recognize that even in the most oppressive tyrannies, the people who accept that bargain are never the people who are targeted with government oppression. I mean, if you look at Mubarak's Egypt, the people who just stayed in their houses and said, I don't really care if we have democracy and if Mubarak continues, or the people who were government supporters weren't the people who were gunned down in the street or put in prison and tortured. The people who were subjected to those abuses were the ones who made themselves threatening to those in power, who went into the squares of Cairo and demanded Mubarak's release. The measure of how free a society is not how the good, subservient citizens are treated. It's how its dissidents are treated. And what I really ultimately realized about what bothered me so much about what Lawrence O'Donnell said, other than the fact that it was Lawrence O'Donnell, was that if you go into American Muslim communities in this country, or if you go and speak with African Americans who have a long history of surveillance abuses, or if you go speak to activists with Occupy, or who work with WikiLeaks, or with Anonymous, or with online activism, or on behalf of Palestinian rights, you will never hear any of those people say, oh, I'm not worried about the system of surveillance that has been constructed. This is something that you can say only if you've accepted this really corruptive argument. So I just want to close with one last point, which is, we're not doing this Q&A because in a crowd this big, I think if you just have 4 or 5 people be able to stand up and ask questions, it kind of creates this illusion that there's interaction, but most people don't get to speak. I'd rather spend the time talking to you individually afterwards. But I know for certain that if we did have a Q&A, one of the first questions I would be asked, if not the single first question, would be, well, you've talked about this really interesting debate that has been sustained around the world for a year now, and there's been all these great revelations, but, what has actually changed? I mean, the NSA is still there in Fort Meade, and they still have all of their servers and computers on, and they're still collecting all of our individual private communications. What really has been altered as a result of these revelations? What has really changed? And I think that the premise embedded in that question, in a lot of ways, misapprehends how political change typically takes place. And I say that because it's really important to recognize that the United States government still is the most powerful government on the earth. And the national security state is the most powerful faction of that most powerful government. And so the walls of the National Security Agency are not going to collapse in on themselves because we publish some of their documents and there's some public anger in the world. That is not how change happens. There's no instant gratification with it. But there is a lot of reason to believe that truly meaningful change will take place. One place that you should not look for that meaningful change to take place is from the US Congress or the United States government itself. And I say that because the United States government is not walking around thinking about how best to limit its own power. That is not how power is exercised. The tactic of the United States government is going to be to pass some kind of legislation that has probably in the title the word reform, that they can call reform, that will let President Obama go before the world and give one of his patented pretty speeches where he says, "We have heard your anger and we have recalibrated in response the balance between security and privacy," which in reality will simply be the illusion of reform that is designed to do nothing other than protect and strengthen that system and let it continue more or less impeded. That is the tactic of the United States when faced with some sort of public scandal. So don't look there. But there are lots of other ways that there's serious pressure being put on the US government. One of which is through the coalition of other countries around the world that are genuinely indignant about these revelations and are working together to undermine US hegemony over the internet. Another way is that the tech companies, the tech giants in Silicon Valley like Facebook and Google and Yahoo and Microsoft, which, by the way, do not care in the slightest about your privacy or the privacy of any of their users, which they demonstrated conclusively by eagerly cooperating with the NSA way beyond what the law requires when they thought there was no cost to doing so because they were doing it in secret. But now they can't do it in secret anymore, and now there is a cost to that cooperation. In fact, there's an enormous cost to the point where they're in full-blown